Good evening, everybody. And welcome to tonight's oral session on everything you wanted to know about accessory dwelling units, accessory apartments.
I'm Bob Ellwanger. I'm a member of the town's Affordable Housing Committee, which is sponsoring tonight's event. We offered this workshop for the first time 2 years ago, since the town had just then liberalized some of the regulations as it pertained to ADUs here in town. And due to the popularity, we offered it again last year about this time of the year. And so this is our third annual information event. And it's good to see all of you here. We promised to answer all the questions you had or think of as we progress tonight. Our panelists represent various perspectives. We've got a great group of subject matter experts, if you will. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge a couple of people who are also here with us tonight. First, the gentleman in the rear, Mark Barnhart, is the director of the town's Community and Economic Development. We also have with us Herb Limecooler, who's the chair of the Affordable Housing Committee, and Steve Grathwalt is right there, who's the vice chair. So what we'll do is we'll give each of our panelists some time to do their presentation. We've got a couple of visuals, and then there'll be plenty of time. We have plenty of time. We're not in a rush. We'll get to all of your questions and comments and observations. Starting us off tonight will be Emmeline Harrigan. She's the assistant planning director for the town, and she'll give us a context for and address some of the emerging trends regarding ADUs, what the town's current zoning regulations are as it pertains to accessory dwelling units, and the process that you'd go through should you be interested in constructing one. And next we'll hear from Rob Daly of Daly Construction, and he'll share some of his experiences actually building accessory dwelling units here in town. After that, we have Denise Walsh, principal of Denise Walsh Team, and she'll offer her insights as a realtor on the marketability of ADUs and her clients' experiences in buying or selling homes that may include them. Lastly, Phyllis Fitzpatrick will share her and her husband Jim's experiences in building an attached accessory apartment here in town. At last year's session, Phyllis also presented, and at that point they were about halfway through, or maybe a little more than halfway through the process. They took occupancy of the unit early this year, and so she can tell us that story as well as how it's ended up and how they're doing in that ADU.
You didn't see what I did.
You will. Thank you. And on that note, so once each of the panelists have presented, we'll have plenty of time for your questions and comments. So, Emmeline, you want to get us started?
About the mid-'80s, there were very strict kind of limitations on how you could build accessory dwelling units at that time. However, even with those stricter regulations, and they were only allowed attached, we ended up with probably, somewhere over like 230 ADUs from that early regulation change, and we would annually review them. There was a much more strict process. We're seeing a lot more demand and you can see it around Fairfield for multifamily with smaller unit sizes, because, and this was something that came out of a transit-oriented development study that we did several years ago. 59% of all households in the U.S. are 1- and 2-person households. In Fairfield, that's even higher. It's 65%. So only 35% of households are households with children. Next slide, please. And the recent data by the ARP kind of shows that we really don't have the right size housing stock for the most part for people in 1- and 2-person households. Our housing stock is really a lot larger. So we have a lot of folks living, single folks, couples living in 3- to 4-bedroom houses that are probably a bit more than they really want to be living in terms of maintenance responsibilities and maintenance costs, but there aren't a lot of options available to them. We feel that ADUs are a good option for folks, especially in this very high cost housing market where folks may want to live extended family not necessarily in the same exact four walls, so ADUs provide a good alternative. We can go to the next slide. So in Fairfield, again, we've had attached ADUs since the mid-'80s. And these are allowed in all of our residential zones, with the exception of the Beach District, which tends to, historically was a summer cottage neighborhood where the streets are both narrow. There are often predominantly the Beach District zone is in a high velocity flood zone, where it's particularly hazardous to increase the density in those neighborhoods. So even with the ADU regulations in the '80s, they were not permitted back then. We've continued that on as we've made our revisions to our regulations. They are now allowed also in our multi-family zones. So we have 2 zoning districts in Fairfield, which allows for as-of-right 2-family structures, duplexes. And we have a zoning district that allows up to 4-family, 4-plex developments that are as-of-right as well. You have to meet minimum lot size requirements in order to do that. But if you live in one of those multifamily districts and you only have a single family residence on that parcel, and it meets the minimum lot size requirement for that zone, you also can add an ADU on that parcel if you choose to do so. So that was a revision to our regulations. In addition, what's kind of carried through in our regulations is that an ADU is not intended to be a duplex where both units are exactly the same size. An ADU is really intended to be an accessory living experience to the main portion of the single family structure, which is intended to be the primary feature on the property. We did play with the cap on that, and we capped that out at not to exceed 1,500 square feet. So, your primary house would have to be big enough to get you up to that limit, and it's always going to be proportional. The owner must reside either in the single-family residence or in the ADU. We don't mandate which one that has to be, but an owner has to live on property. The other thing that came about 3 years ago when we first did this workshop is the Plan and Zoning Commission. They decided that they were going to allow for detached accessory dwelling units, but as a first dip their toe in the waters regulation, they decided to allow that in our larger lot zones. So those range from the residential R3 zone, residential AA zone, and the residential AAA zone. R3 is a minimum lot size of 20,000 square feet. AA is 1 acre. AAA is 2-acre parcels. We have historically had some accessory dwelling units, for lack of better terminology, in those zones, particularly where there were caretakers for the property, au pairs who lived on property. So some of the structures that are more historic in larger lot zones, they can also have those that might predate our regulations, and that's perfectly fine as well. They're pre-existing non-conforming. The same standard does apply. The owner must live in one part or the other. They can choose to live in the smaller, cottage as it were, or the space above the garage, however they use it. And you're still capped out at that 1,500 square foot size limitation. The lot does have to meet the minimum lot size requirements. So if you had an R3 parcel and it's smaller than that minimum 20,000, right now our regulations wouldn't permit you to have a detached ADU on the parcel. And you're not allowed to have more than 1 ADU on the parcel, even in a detached scenario. So you couldn't have one both attached to the house and then detached. Next slide, please. So we did away with a couple of different things a few years ago. It used to be that if you wanted to build a house large enough to contain your primary structure and an attached ADU within the regulations, I think the Plan and Zoning Commission, they thought, there's going to be such a run. People are going to run out and they're going to make these really huge houses. And they're really, what we find is that, yes, there's more demand for them today, but you have a lot of contractors who are still just exclusively building single-family homes. And, people really, there is a demand to build them, but that demand is driven by wanting an extra little piece of, something to house their extended family is what we found over time, because we used to actually annually certify these. Property owners would have to come to our office with a notarized statement that indicated that they still lived on site, and they had to tell us who was living there as well. We never had the restriction here in Fairfield that it had to be a family member. So even back in the 80s, if you had an ADU, you could rent it to a non-related party. Here in Fairfield, though, we do have a requirement through our local health department that you do have to have that unit reviewed if you're renting it to a non-related party, and it has to meet certain health code requirements for what's called a certificate of rental occupancy. So that is mandated. Next slide, please. That's pretty much all I have. But I think Bob asked me to kind of speak about the process. Here in Fairfield, if you're applying for an accessory dwelling unit, there's no public hearing, provided that you meet all of our requirements. We have an online permitting system called City Squared. You would just need to have your survey that shows where that ADU is going to be located, if you're doing an addition onto the house, or if you're doing it, if you meet the requirements to do a detached ADU, you have to provide to us a survey, your building plans, and normally, sometimes your contractor will do that for you. In the plan and zoning side of things, as a homeowner, you can apply for those permits as well. And then I think I'll let Rob speak to the building permit side of it, where he can get into more specifics about tradesmen and all of that. But generally, when you submit to plan and zoning, I would say it's likely that you could probably get your permit within about 3 weeks, is kind of the average time. Sometimes, keep in mind that if you are expanding the footprint of your structure, current Department of Energy and Environmental Protection requirements do require that you also consider on-site runoff detention on your property. And a lot of folks will do that through an underground system called a Coltex. So there are little, there are some additional considerations that you have to think about in terms of your construction project. So, keep that in mind. And that's pretty much all I have. I'm certainly, you can always call the Plan and Zoning Office if you have any questions. We're usually kind of the first stop in terms of your permitting requirements, and then we would transfer you to building for how you have to build it, the construction, life safety requirements.
Great. Thank you, Emmeline. Before we go to Rob, though, quick question. About how many ADUs are there in town, and have we seen an upsurge in applications over the past 3 years since we liberalized some of the regs?
I would say, so right now I think we're up to about 260 or so. So we have seen growth, and I think since we opened up our regulations, it's probably a combination of that plus the, it's really challenging when we talk to folks who come to us at the counter and start asking these questions. Sometimes they're really looking for a living situation. They're, empty nester household with much older kids, sometimes grandkids, and they're looking for a way for their family members to move back to Fairfield, and they can't afford to do that, so they figure out a way to do that on one parcel. What we're seeing now, I think when I just pulled the data for just this past year, I think we were up to something like 15 applications for this year, which is trending upwards. It was certainly a lot. It's a little slower. Like anything, construction can ebb and flow, but right now we're seeing a demand for it.
Terrific. Thank you. Rob?
Hi, Rob Daly, Daly Construction, Midland Contracting. Quick background, my family has been building in Fairfield County since 1956. I'm third generation. My grandfather started the company. My father was predominantly a developer, new homes, condos, everything under the sun. Fairfield, Westport, Darien were our main areas. We've expanded down to Greenwich, but since COVID, so I would say in the last 5 years, we've gotten a high demand for ADUs. Currently, we're working on 4. We've completed about 9 in the last, I would say, 5 to 6 years. And what we've seen since COVID is a big jump in clients who are younger, people my age, 40s, their parents are trying to retire. It's too expensive to buy a new build or a condo, and it makes more sense financially for them to build an ADU on the property. People ask us, numerous questions, but first and foremost is like, what's the cost to build? Cost to build per square foot on an ADU is actually more expensive than a normal home, in a sense, because you're consolidating all these finishes, bathrooms, kitchens, which are the most expensive portion of the build, into a smaller space. So generally speaking, for a mid to high end, you're $325 to $350 a square foot, $350 a square foot to build. Where the savings is you have no land cost, obviously. So when you put the cost of build with the netting out the cost of land, it actually is much more affordable than buying something new. And we found a big upswing in that. Currently, we have 3 that are attached, and it's same thing. It's husband and wife and their kids, building on, adding on for the mother-in-law, father-in-law to retire into. A lot of them are, some of them have homes in Florida, and they come up here for, they want it for both seasons. Some are full-time. But we've seen, for us, it's one of our biggest markets now, where we were home renovators, new homes. My father in particular, who's still working, basically only is building ADUs for the last 2 years. He's currently working on one in Westport. We finished one in Black Rock. He finished one in Easton before that. And all the same. Retirees moving in with their children, saving. They looked around the area and what they found, and condo prices for 1,200 square feet where they could build themselves an 800 to 1,000 square foot ADU became more affordable. Especially with, as Emily was saying, the regulations being lifted, because it was, I would say before 2020, pre-COVID, I don't think I ever did one. I don't remember doing one, and I've been doing it for 20 years. My father says the same thing. It was very limited. And I think there was like a rule at one point where you could build, had to be attached, you couldn't have a stove in it. Right. Remember that? It was like, there's some weird rules, and you
Can't have a kitchen.
couldn't have a functioning kitchen. You could have a fridge, but you couldn't have a stove.
We like to call that the wet bar.
The wet bar. And it was a wet bar, and somehow after they got a C of O, a stove always snuck into that space. I don't know how that happened, but anyway, so we've seen a big uptick in it, and for us it makes sense. It's an easy build for us, easy to attach on the rear. We've done 2 detached currently. One my father's working on right now in Westport, and it's like 1,400 square foot, 2 bathroom, 2 bedroom, full kitchen. It's a bigger, it's much larger. I think the family, their daughter is going to move into it eventually, and they did it for her. But yeah, so the cost to build, as I was talking to Phyllis, a couple things that are quirky with ADUs, especially if you're going to rent it. Your utilities have to go through the main house. You can't separate utilities on an ADU in Fairfield, Westport, Bridgeport, which is definitely different, because you can put water meter mains on, which is like a meter that basically kind of calculates how much water usage, and then you have to bill them for you. Same thing with the electrical. You can kind of guess on how much electricity they're using, but the billing does become a little choppy. If it's an in-law and your mother-in-law is living there, hopefully you're an outstanding child, and you just say, hey, I'll pay for the utilities. You just, you pay for some of the taxes, some of the bills, but that's one of the difficult things with the ADUs that we found, is that you can't split utilities. So if you are going to rent it, I guess you have to do something with your tenant on how you fix that. Besides that, it's been a great experience for us, and we've seen, a lot of, the one we did in Easton, she was a single mom, her husband had passed. She moved in with her children, and, it's become a lot easier experience for her to live, pay the bills. She helps with the children. It's, we've seen a lot of positivity from it, and it's been growing and growing. Like I said, one of our major markets now is ADUs. We work with an architect out of Westport. His name's John Roundtree. Fantastic. If anybody's looking for an architect in the room for an ADU, he specializes in them. And he's basically geared his business towards only designing ADUs. That's how much demand there is currently. Besides that, you know, it's basically like building a regular house or a renovation, you know, there's nothing crazy about it. Fairfield has become very easy to work with us, as long as you're inside the zoning regs. You know, obviously your plans have to meet code, you know, as long as you're inside, you know, everything meets building code. It's not too difficult to get a permit. Obviously, if you have to get a variance, it's a whole different story, but that's basically it.
Rob, do you want to speak to the two examples that we
Yes, so
there's
this is the first one. This is 201 Old, and that was actually is a rental. So it's an ADU off the rear of the house. They were fortunate enough to be in between two streets, so the ADU has its own driveway. It's still listed as 201 Old Mill. It's the same address, but they have their own driveway. That is a 1-bed, 1 full bath, beautiful kitchen. It's actually a very nice ADU. I think it's like 1,100 square feet, deck, the whole thing. So that was one we just completed last year. I think maybe 8 months ago, 8 to 12 months ago, I think we did that. Yep. This is Lucille. This is 351 Lucille. If you can see the top right slide, that whole thing is the ADU. It's actually a 4-car garage. They went big on the garage. And I think it was a 920 square foot ADU above. Same thing, 1 bedroom in the front, master bed in the front, master bath, huge living area, great room, kitchen, living area. And we did that, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. I can't remember exactly, but both attached. That has a breezeway. The other one, the first slide, there's no breezeway, there's no access. It's a rental. This one, there is a breezeway access from the main house to the rental and to the garage. And this one was for a mother-in-law. So she, I think the family is from Westchester. Kids were, moved here, careers are here. They have 2 children. Grandmother wanted to be here, so we built that. Same thing. She looked around, couldn't find anything, and affordable, and it ended up being more affordable for her to put up, the money and build the ADU with the garage above. And they actually wanted a new garage. Kind of worked out for both people. But yeah, those were 2 that we did, and we've done. I don't have slides of it, but the one in Black Rock we just recently did was a detached, completely detached, and that is a full-on rental. And as she said, and actually in Bridgeport, they maxed out at 800 square feet. So you have a larger square foot. Milford and Bridgeport are 800. Westport and
the size of the lots too.
the lots, but no, even with the size of the lot, because the one we did, there was a second building lot, a completely second building lot on the property, and it was 800 maxed out for their ADU, and Milford is the same. Westport is also 1,500, and I think Easton is well 1,500. So different towns have different regs on the size. But yeah, so we've been doing them, and I hope to continue to do them because they're great projects.
So I guess I wasn't aware that if it's an attached ADU, it doesn't have to have an entrance into the main residence?
Nope.
Okay.
You can block it off as a
Block
pure
it off
rental.
as a pure
Yeah,
rental.
and that's what there was, so the one we did on Old Mill, the first slide,
Yeah.
it was, there was an attachment, and at one point, the family lived there, and I think the elderly mother lived in the other section. She passed, they sold the house, and the couple that bought it wanted just to have it as a pure rental, so we blocked off the wall and redid, did the whole thing over, but, yeah. And I'm sorry, I actually have to leave because I have children at home and a babysitter that has to leave.
So before you do, questions?
So if anybody has questions, yes, I'm so sorry that I have to leave early.
Rob the Builder,
Yeah.
questions? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the dirty word, the tax assessor. What is it, do we know what the implications are for real estate taxes? I mean, is it,
I don't know.
it's new construction, so obviously it's probably a higher
Of course.
assessment.
I don't know.
But maybe our Phyllis can
I'll answer this a little bit in terms of, because we get this for all improvements that you make. So even if you were just doing an addition that wasn't an ADU, or you were building a new garage on your property, our assessor's department gets a report from the building department. So every time you make an improvement, whether it's you're remodeling a kitchen, A lot of folks these days, they want to
First floor plan, right? So they are blowing out the whole first floor, making it big, wide, and open. When you read your tax card, it will describe the quality of your construction, and that drives the price of your improvements on your property. So even if you do a kitchen remodel, your kitchen may go from a quality of fair to modern, and then that modern has a different per square foot price associated to the value of your dwelling. What I tell people is houses are like cars, they depreciate over time unless you invest in them, and when you invest in them and pull your building permits, that information goes to our tax assessor. So yes, appropriately, if the market value of your home increases because you've added this additional amenity, your taxes will go up as well.
One thing I'd like to speak on that is, in which we've talked about with clients as well, adding an ADU on, and yes, the value of the overall home is going to go up, but if you actually net out what it is, the square footage you add on compared to buying a new house of the same square footage, it's usually less. So
Because
it's
there's
not
no
true
extra
for, it's
land.
not, yeah,
No issue.
no extra land.
The extra land.
Exactly, so you're not paying the property.
Next question.
I have a question for Rob about building. Are there reasons why it's better to have a builder who has direct experience with ADU building as opposed to regular building? And what are those reasons?
I guess you're just familiar with, one, the regulations and what you're allowed to do. Two, building a detached ADU is basically like building a new home, right? So,
Just smaller.
it's just smaller, exactly. It's smaller, it's easier, it's actually a lot faster to build. Would I say that there's, another builder that builds new homes, or myself on a detached, is it the same thing? It's, yeah, because in essence, you're just building a new house. With the connections and certain other points, a builder like me who has, we're knowledgeable on how to connect the utilities, how to do sub-paneling, how to do the metering, it helps to have somebody that's more knowledgeable on those things, so you know how to, do it. Also permitting, how to navigate the permitting and what's gonna be required. As she mentioned, the Coltex and all the underground water stuff, you have to, when you do a ADU, in Fairfield, if you add more than 200 square feet, you have to put underground retention. Some people don't know this, and it could turn into, so when we did this house, because we added X amount of square feet and we attached, they actually made us bring up the whole entire house onto a retention system. And it was rather large. It was,
Wow.
I think it was like 10 tanks. It was probably about a $20,000 retention system that we had to add for this property here. So knowing that stuff and going into it, budgeting, I guess I would say that I'm more knowledgeable than somebody that doesn't do them, knowing that there's going to be the little ins and outs that you have to know to tell your clients to what to expect.
What's the retention system on that?
It's an underground, basically they look like massive half plastic barrel. Like if you took a big plastic cylinder and you cut it in half, put gravel in it, they don't want water runoff to go into the sewer system in the street anymore. They want it to be put back into the ground, so the groundwater is, our groundwater is at the same level it should be. So all your downspouts, gutters, leaders, everything pitches back into this underground system so that the water levels retain.
So it can percolate into the ground.
Yeah, it percolates into the ground.
ADUs have to have that?
Yes, anything over 200 square feet, which it's impossible to build one without it, so yes, they all have to have it. And if you have wetlands or any kind of issues, that can cause them.
One last question for Rob before he has to leave. Go ahead.
I can take a couple more.
When I said 300 to 325 per square feet,
Mm.
other examples I've heard, 2 to 250, you're saying 300, like what drives that besides obviously
Yeah.
materials?
I was going to say, so people ask us this with homes all the time as well. Could you do one for 250? Sure. It depends on the materials you're using. Actually, attaching them is more expensive, shockingly. When you attach to a house, the connection points, if you're doing a standalone, it's less expensive than when you're tying in, building off the house, renovating, because then you have to renovate part of the new house, plus build it in. And the roof, and the time, yeah, it becomes a little bit more costly when you do an attached, to be honest with you. Can you, say, hey, you want to use certain types of material, you don't want, instead of hardwood, you use carpet or luxury vinyl plank, you use vinyl siding, vinyl window, of course there's a way to manipulate the pricing, but what we found in general, just a mid to high level ADU is 3 to 325 is a good number to put in your head on where you're gonna be to get a, product. Like this one was about, I think we were, and this was 4 years ago, but or 3 years ago, I think we were at 275 to 300 on that one. And the one, we're currently doing one in Westport, which is definitely higher end, and I think they're at like 425 a square foot.
Have you done any that are like more of a basement versus attached or detached?
No, and I don't know what the regulations would be on just having a basement ADU. You'd have to certainly have 2 means of egress, so you have to have certain things that you have to meet. Just from a building standpoint, ways for firefighters to get in and out. I've not seen it. I would think there would be some code issues with that. I'm sure you could do it, but it would, you have to have an architect that would design it in a way that would be compliant with, all the codes that the building department would want.
Quick
Yeah.
question, how much is the one on Mill?
Old Mill,
Old Mill,
that was in 300 range.
that was the.
Yeah, give or take, yep.
Per square foot.
Then once again, that was
square.
per square foot.
Per square
Yes,
foot.
so per square foot. So, they cedar siding, a brand new, high-end kitchen, nice bathroom, very, very, it was very high-end, very nice. So, it's, yeah, there's no set price, obviously, but I'm just giving you an average
Yes,
on
sir.
what we see.
Speaking of basements, my house is on a property that has a ditch, so the back side of the basement is exposed as windows and next to it. So that's what I was thinking of doing it. With any, I guess, issues, would they be covered during the application process?
No, if you have means of egress in a walkout basement, I think you'd probably be better off. You'd be fine, It's the basements that are down, don't have a bilco, and you have to go up a set of stairs to get down. So that's where you have an issue, because you only have one means of egress, and I don't think they'd be compliant. If you have a walkout, I think you could probably pull it off a lot easier. And once again, you'd have to get an architect to draw up a set of plans, go through the building, and the building department would tell you. But I would think you'd be fine in that instance to have an accessory dwelling in the basement, yeah.
Yes.
The retention system, is that on all new construction?
All new. And Fairfield is not other towns are, but, most towns now have follow suit, but, yes, anything over 200 square feet that you're adding, it's a must. You have to get an engineer, civil engineer to calculate the runoff and all that. And they'll tell you what kind of a system you have to have.
Put it in your lawn.
Yes, you have to be, the only requirements really are 10 feet off the property line, 10 feet off the house. So you don't get water back in your house, you're never putting it in your neighbor's yard. And then you do sometimes have to do a perk test showing your water levels and where the heights of the water is. So say you have a high water table and you're putting this in, you might have to have a special system designed by an engineer where the water will go back in without overflooding and having backfill on your property. So you do have to hire a civil engineer in certain instances. Fairfield is actually really good. The engineering department is very easy to work with, where you can hand in a set of plans and they'll tell you, okay, well, X amount of square feet, property's okay, this is how many, they're called Coltex or storm tank. This is how many infiltrators you need. Some towns like Trumbull, are very, very strict, will not accept a report without a civil engineer designing it. They won't even consider the plan. You have to put it in, they have to do the drainage calcs, all that stuff. And it takes a lot of time and it's not cheap.
How much is it?
It could be, so usually, generally speaking, they're tanks, right? So we say about $2,000 a tank.
And I have another question. What if you make an ADU in your house, it's attached to your house, it's separate entrance, and then everybody dies? Then what happens to that house? I mean, you said an owner has to live in the
This is
house.
past my,
Well,
I'm a builder, not a,
Yeah, so-
I don't know about the whole depth thing. I don't know.
I mean, at some point, that property will transfer to
Yeah.
a different owner, right? So, whoever, if it's an error
The
or.
owner then has to keep the ADU or get rid of it.
Well,
No,
actually, over time, we have had ADUs removed from structures.
You can.
So, people can do that, and they have chosen to do that over time.
The one at Old Mill that we did, I was saying, the mother of the person, she did pass, and they ended up selling the house, and, and they just modified it into a rental as opposed to a mother-in-law. So, as long as it's permitted, and you pass and you get a C of O, a certificate of occupancy for the dwelling, I think you can do whatever you want with it at after the, time the purchase.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, Mark, could you do me a favor and just go back a couple of slides? We'll leave Rob's contact information up for a moment or two.
Great, thank you so
Thank
much.
you so
Sorry,
much.
guys, I
Appreciate it.
apologize. See, if I had the money to do an ADU, I'd have my mother live in with me, and she could be watching the kids. But
That's a really good point.
Yeah,
That's where my daughter's from.
all right, thank you,
Nice
Rob.
seeing you guys. Thank you, Denise.
Oh, nice to see you.
Bye, everybody, have a nice night.
Bye-bye.
Next up, Denise Walsh.
So before I make my comments, just to know what to emphasize, if you could raise your hands, how many of you are looking at this as a potential investment like rental income? And how many of you are looking at this for lifestyle, for in other words, your kids to live in, your mother to live in? What?
Because you're going to rent it to them.
That's, yeah. Okay, so that helps me a lot. So going to the, for family members or extended family, the things to think about with that we've seen, and both you and Rob brought up some really good points and already addressed what the restrictions are, the cost of building. One of the things, I don't know if you mentioned, is that when it's attached or the accessory building, the entrance has to be in the rear or side, right? It cannot be in the front. You can't have two front. Is that still, do you still follow that
I think we got rid of
rule?
that. I don't think we have it anymore.
Okay, I wasn't sure about that. So just something to consider. But there's a lot that goes into this besides resale value. Is really lifestyle value. So when you're thinking about this, which both of them mentioned, is the cost to purchase separately. I'm working with a client right now and we're going through this. And we're looking at condos right now in Fairfield, maybe certain areas of Trumbull or Bridgeport, but she doesn't want to be away, she can't be too far away from, I don't want to say they're caregivers, but they're looking after her. And we can't find anything under $450,000, two-bedroom, that would suit her needs, where she would feel comfortable in Fairfield, close enough. But if her son, who lives in Fairfield, was willing, and they're willing to move, and find a place where they could add an ADU, whether attached or detached, and it was going to cost $250,000 or $350,000, that would be a great alternative for her. She would be close enough for them to keep an eye on her. She wouldn't be spending as much money. She wouldn't be paying as much taxes because they're not buying extra land. And there's features that they could put into the house for her that she can't find in the condos. The main thing to think about, if you're building an ADU for a family member, whether they're older, they're handicapped, they're young, you really want to think about degrees of separation. Degrees of separation will add resale value. So in other words, how is the house, if it's attached, how is it separated? How is their access? Is it private enough? Do they have a private patio, a private place to sit? What does the house look like architecturally? But especially that degree of separation, if you're thinking about, if I do this for my parent, what about resale if she decides to move out or something in our life changes and we have to sell the house? So I would just say keep in mind that degree of separation, the way they enter, the way they enjoy the outside, soundproofing if it's attached. If you want to be close, but you want it separate, again, that's that degree of separation. It was great to hear from the builder that it was less expensive to make it separate. If you have the choice and it doesn't affect your care, having it separate is a degree of separation that is going to add value on resale, is going to add value for rental. So when you look at attached rentals, I had one in the lake area. It was 1,600 square feet because you could definitely hear what was going on next door. And because there wasn't really a separate place to sit outside on a patio without feeling like you had your own space. I also rented a garage that was repurposed into an ADU on Reading Road. It was brand new on the inside. It was not huge. It was definitely under 1,500 square feet, and they got $3,800 for it per month to a single individual. The other thing is, and this is more your expertise, I don't believe you can have more than 2 people in an ADU. So 2 people only.
But I will say, we're not kicking out babies.
Right.
I'm sorry.
Although I did talk to someone in planning and zoning, and he goes, we do get calls occasionally saying, hey, you know, we notice kids at the bus stop, and the primary owner is like in their 60s, so we don't think it's their kids. So they call and tell on you. So those are the neighbors, not planning and zoning.
Just before we move on from that, is there a reason for that? Why do we not let them?
Well, I think because, you know, they were really kind of intended as smaller spaces, right? So again, if we're right sizing the size of the housing unit, the home, to the number of people that should live in there, this isn't intended to be a single-family home. It's intended to be something for more modestly sized households. It's not a duplex, right? We're not
Right.
intending to have 2 full entire families living on one parcel. It's meant to be a bonus, you know.
I think the fear was in the community is we don't want single-family, and I think a lot of people don't want single-family properties to start to feel like multifamily properties. And then you have more cars, you
Right.
have more people, et cetera. I think it was a little bit of an experiment that worked well, that's working well, where people who are handicapped by taxes, you've lived in your house for 50 years, and now maybe you can't afford the taxes, so you're going to add on a rental. And now you can stay in age in place. And that became a real hardship over the last few years as property values increased, yay, but the taxes also increased as a byproduct of that.
Sure. There's a question
Oh,
here
yeah,
up
sorry.
front and then in the back.
So how do you define attached and detached? I mean, would detached be attached because there's what you call a breezeway? Like, how do you define
No, attached has to be,
shared wall or?
has to have a shared wall.
Okay.
So what some folks have done is they've actually put a mudroom in between the 2. And that's kind of worked where, you know, people can kind of come into that space and they'll go into, it's almost like an alcove. We would call it an alcove in an apartment building, right?
Because that would certainly fix the noise or the sharing of walls and the noise and actually add value to the home as it's kind of detached but not, because you're saying there's a mud room in
Right.
between.
Right.
I will just caution that depending on the size of your property, we would have to look and see how feasible all of that is. Sometimes you might not have the space based on setbacks, based on lot coverage. So we would look at all of that to determine whether or not that's feasible.
And the 40% rule.
Right.
Depending on where you're
Sometimes if it's a shared mudroom, we won't count that towards the ADU. So we do have a little bit of flexibility in terms of looking at it and saying, well, this is a shared entry point for both. You know, if there were
Sure.
doors that led into both of them, we would go,
Sure.
well, you know, if you're that close, we're not gonna, I don't think we would ding
Say,
you.
for example, that mud would lead you to the garage, and then on the other side leads you to the ADU, that would be probably.
Yeah, I mean, it would still be attached,
Okay.
yeah.
An ADU attached to a garage as opposed to the house, that still is attached?
Not if the
No?
garage is not attached.
No, I mean if the garage is attached.
Yes,
So if you have a house and you have a garage and you're gonna add on to the back of the garage or above, that's a great degree of separation to have as opposed to, but the mudroom idea is great because they know you're not gonna be watching TV in the mudroom or living in the mudroom. So that's somewhat of a degree of separation, but another idea is to use the garage to add on to if you're looking for a degree of separation, because even in multifamilies, when they say, or communities that are condos, they'll say the only shared wall is with the garages. That has a greater buyer pool and, you know, greater value.
As opposed to taking from your original square footage, which is not ideal either,
So I can,
How does
so,
that work?
so I, that's a really great point, and I've had this problem a lot. When a homeowner has a house and they've taken a portion of that house and then allot it to be an in-law, you really, the homeowner says, oh, now I'm worth $100,000 more. No, you're not, because you haven't increased the square footage. If anything, you've decreased the amount of primary living space that a buyer expects to get in a house that size. So unless you have someone that absolutely needs it, so now you're fishing, when you're selling your house, you're fishing with a pole instead of a net, because you're looking for that one person who really needs that. Otherwise, you're not really creating so much extra value.
Buyer, that's gonna be
It's a very specific buyer, and they're not always out there when, in that 3 weeks you want to sell your house. So you do want to be careful about that. Although the people who need it, it is of value to them. There is some extra value. We sold a house on Lover's Lane. And we did very well on it, went over asking, it was multiple bid, and they did have an apartment that was attached, and it was well done, and the way that it was attached was well done. And it had a little second floor, so it was kind of, 2-story against 2-story, but it was well done. And the people who bought it weren't really going to use it as an in-law. They were going to make it a master suite. Oh.
Wow.
And when their parent moved out, they used it as an office suite, the current homeowner. So the other thing I would say to those of you who are thinking of doing this for handicap, aging in place, mature, relatives, that type of thing, is really look at accessibility. Even if you're going to do it as a rental, depending, for a certain crowd of profiles, having that walk-in shower, a little bit of a wider door into the bathroom, on-grade living. This is where your basement ADU may be much less expensive to build than your on-grade ADU, but a younger family doesn't want to do all those steps up and down. An older person does not want to do all the steps up and down. So when you're thinking about doing this for the future, also for resale and for rental, after it's no longer needed for a family member, you really want to think about accessibility. On-grade living space, on-grade bedroom, your entry and exits, and especially into the bathrooms, and having that walk-in shower is huge. Because it's really hard to change those things once the house is built. It's expensive. And you appeal to a broader profile. A young single couple isn't going to care if it's a walk-in bath, but they're not going to mind it either. So you're appealing to almost all segments. What else did I want to mention? As far as separate utilities, if you have a house that is oil, and you're doing an ADU, and it's separate or it's attached, and it is going to have separate HVAC system, and you make it propane, I'm assuming that's legal, and so.
I would assume most people these days are doing mini splits.
Or
I gotta
mini,
be honest.
well,
Right.
no, the
You know.
reason why I'm bringing it
Yeah.
up, the reason why I'm bringing it up is separate utilities.
Yeah.
So for heating. So a mini split is a great,
Yeah,
I
it's-
love mini
You
splits.
see them a lot in restaurants, actually, where it's something that is usually at the top, near the ceiling, and it's got its own condenser that is outside of the wall of that house, and it can both heat and cool.
And that's
And they're
actually.
very efficient, and so we're seeing those a lot, even in additions. We're seeing them in additions where they're not just doing like baseboard or running all of the HVAC, they're just doing mini splits. It's a much more efficient, easier way to kind of heat a bigger space.
Especially if you're taking a portion of your house and you want to, maybe you're doing a small addition, or you're taking a portion of your house already, the mini splits are just awesome, because the ductwork isn't going through your closets. You're not retrofitting inside,
Right.
like she said, it's all going outside. And I think the buyers today are becoming much more educated. Now, a lot of people still ask, what is a mini split, especially first-time home buyers? But the buyer population is becoming more educated, and they do understand the mini split. And you could get a mini split that heats and cools 2,500 square feet.
So how does that change your bill?
So my point was, if you are oil and you are adding on, it's going to have a separate HVAC system. It's not working off of yours. You're not expanding yours. You could do propane. Now you know every time you have a propane bill, it's only for that portion of the house.
Right.
So you want to think about, if you can't put in a separate gas meter, because it's not allowed. I'm just mentioning a workaround might be changing the heat source, the heat fuel.
Can I ask a lot question?
What? Oh, yeah.
So you mentioned 20,000 square feet, right, for as one of the requirements in order to have a detached ADU, is that right?
R3.
It, depending on what your zone for your lot is.
So
So
what if you're in zone A, which you have a
Single A?
0.44 acre lot, you have two lots.
So here's what I will say to you. We are going to be revising our zoning regulations. And what I will tell you is when we did revise our zoning regulations about 3 years ago, there were plenty of our plan and zoning commissioners who said, I don't understand why we don't allow detached for everybody. As long as it meets the setback requirements, you know, we think about where that should be on the lot and we provide standards, why should we limit it? We've had a lot of inquiry, frankly, from folks who are in the A zone. We've had a lot of inquiry from folks who are in the flood zone in the A zone and really can't touch their house because they don't want to go over what's called the substantial improvement number to then have to retrofit their house and, you know, do some sort of thing like that. So there have been some variances issued for detached